Hello and welcome to another screencast, this time in the types of goals and SMART targets. So a reminder in terms of this PowerPoint, the yellow text boxes refer to the tasks for students, the green text boxes are for the note-taking sections for students, the blue text boxes are any differentiation tasks, and the red text boxes are for teaching and learning strategies. So what does the syllabus basically ask about this specific topic? Well, ultimately you need to be able to have a clear definition of performance goals and outcome goals. You need to be able to apply both of those types of goals to sporting settings and be able to evaluate the suitability of them based on the levels of ability of the performer. And ultimately you need to be able to apply the SMART principle of in terms of target setting. So what does SMART actually stand for, and how is it used to improve sports? Okay, so first question, you might want to pause your video here. Why do we set goals in sport? Okay, so ultimately, even before we just answer this question, we need to understand what sort of a goal is. So ultimately, it's seen as a result of our endeavour. So by setting a goal, we're kind of seeing whether we're able to achieve that ultimately. Why do we set goals? So ultimately it's to monitor progress. It's to see how well we performed and whether we made any progress in regards to our training and in the event itself. Ultimately, we try to provide the athlete with better focus, better concentration. So by setting those goals, we can ensure they feel and are motivated. Also helps in terms of the planning, the training aspects of them performing. So if we have goals, then we've got specific training goals, and that will help again with our planning. Obviously, it helps demonstrate success. So if we can monitor progress, we can actually see whether we've become successful, perhaps in our outcome, whether it be the event or the actual training itself. And finally, it provides the performer with motivation, and that's really important, isn't it, in regards to intrinsic motivation, so whether they're internally motivated coming from within, and the external motivation, the extrinsic motivation will be there as well in regards to perhaps that tangible reward, so to know that we've actually made some progress. So ultimately it helps with motivation. Okay, so let's first of all look at performance goals. Ultimately, you need to be aware that performance goals kind of refers to this idea of personal standards being achieved. And ultimately, when we're looking at the performance goals, we're thinking about the process. We're thinking about the technique. So ultimately, performers compare themselves against what they've already done and what they're suggesting to do in the future. So there's no comparison here with other performers. This is based on our own technique. This is based on our own progress. Ultimately, the performance goals, as it says there, allows the athlete to focus on details of the performance itself, but not just the winning and losing element. So like I said before, we're actually focusing on the technique itself. So just want you to pause the video here in this specific task, and can you provide an example of a performance goal? Okay, so one example you could have given here in regards to performance goals could have been something along the lines of a 400-meter sprinter trying to beat their personal best. Okay, that's a performance goal. We might also have a basketball player who's trying to score the highest level possible in the multi-stage fitness test. Okay, so these are referred to as performance goals. You could have even talked about a specific tennis player looking at a forehand or a backhand and how many times they're able to hit winners in one particular set. That would be kind of a performance goal. Okay, so let's look at outcome goals next. So ultimately, outcome goals refer to the end product, so the end result. So whether we're winning or losing. So what have we actually achieved from our actual performance ultimately? Okay. So again, just want you to pause the video here and think about what is an example of an outcome goal. Okay, so an outcome goal, I've given the example there, a pole vaulter may aim to finish first place in a major championship. You may have, for example, a specific sports team whose outcome goal for the season might be to finish in the top 4 places of the league, which might mean that they get to play in the Champions League the following year. Okay, so these are referred to as outcome goals, so the end product, the end result. Okay, and then let's move on to SMART targets. So ultimately, when we're looking at SMART targets, each of those letters of SMART represents a specific word. And ultimately, this is the reason why we set SMART targets, is to increase motivation and also to reduce anxiety. If we set ourselves a too difficult target, that is unachievable, and ultimately that's going to demotivate us, and it also might cause us anxiety, because ultimately we know ourselves that we're not going to be able to achieve that. Ultimately, these goals must be SMART. Okay, and the first letter S refers to as specific. So the target itself, the goal itself, must be specific to the demands of the sport, maybe the muscles being used or the movement types being used in that specific sport. It also needs to be measurable, so we need to be able to measure our goal. Ultimately, if we can't measure it, then we can't see whether we've made any progress in it. So that could be through time, it could be through some sort of measurement. If we're looking at long jump, for example, so we're applying some units, whether it be centimeters, meters, to our actual target. It needs to be accepted, so ultimately the performer, and if there's a coach involved perhaps, needs to be able to agree and accept that specific target. And ultimately that's going to really help in terms of being able to identify a realistic target. If it's accepted, if it's agreed, then it's likely that it's going to be realistic. We're not going to set unachievable, unrealistic targets, because ultimately we want to keep ourselves motivated. So it has to be realistic within our limits, within our means. And finally, it needs to be time bound, so it needs to have a set period of time. So we need to set that specific goal, that target, over a certain period of time, okay, so that we can see where we were initially at the starting point and where we are at the end point. So there is a time frame. Okay, so let's try and apply goals now, and let's try and apply them effectively. So I'm going to set you this question again. You might want to pause your video here, but you're coaching a beginner tennis player. Okay, so you're the coach, and you're sort of coaching this beginner tennis player. What type of goals would be suitable for her, and why? So look back at the two types of goals that we've looked at, and which is most suitable for her, and try and explain why. Okay, so hopefully you've got some ideas down, and ultimately for a beginner, we're looking at performance goals being more suitable for her, and there are a few reasons why, and I'm just going to go through them with you now. So as she's a beginner, ultimately she hasn't developed her technique properly. Okay, so outcome goals are looking at that end product, that end result of whether we've won that tournament, whether we've won that match, and so on. And for a beginner, we're not really looking at the outcome at this stage, because ultimately it's likely that if we were looking at the outcome, that she would probably be unsuccessful the majority of the time. And if that was the case, then obviously that would demotivate her. So we don't want to set outcome goals. We want to be setting performance goals. The second point, as it says there, is if we're focusing on the quality of her performance, if we're focusing on her technique, she's not thinking about the end results. So ultimately, she's only looking to apply herself in that technical ability at that stage, improving her performance. Okay. And the next point is quite important as well, because ultimately, when we set performance goals, and especially in an individual sport like this, okay, it can't be affected by anyone else apart from the individual themselves. So the beginner tennis player here, she will be the one that's in control of whether she's making progress with her technique. So she'll be listening to hopefully the feedback, she'll be watching some of that feedback as well. Okay, but ultimately she's in control of her actions. So performance goals really help in that aspect. And then finally, it says their performance goals will enable her to improve her technique and ultimately make her better in the long run. And eventually, hopefully, those performance goals that she has applied and she's set will help her hopefully eventually achieve some of the outcome goals that she will start to create as she gets better, as her level improves. Okay, so differentiation task, you might want to set yourself now, you might want to pause the video here, but what are some of the negative impacts if we set the beginner some outcome goals? Okay, let's also try to apply goals effectively to the hurdler here. So again, you're coaching the Olympic hurdler. You can pause your video here. What goals are going to be suitable for this type of athlete? Okay, so most of you would have probably written down that outcome goals are most suited, but I think it's really important to note that a combination of both outcome and performance goals will be suitable for this type of athlete. Yes, obviously we're looking at outcome goals. She's an expert in her event, in her field, and ultimately by setting those outcome goals, you may have talked about the fact that it's going to keep her focused, it's going to keep her motivated, especially for the upcoming events, whether it be a world championship, whether it be an Olympic event. Okay, but ultimately we might want to also set her at times some performance goals within her training, because ultimately there may be small adjustments, might be short-term goals that we need to set her to help her with refining, changing her technique slightly so that she has the edge over her competitors. Again, differentiation task, you might want to pause the video here again, but can we now try and apply these goals? So can you give examples of a performance goal for this athlete and an outcome goal? Okay, so the last section of this presentation looks at applying the SMART principle, okay, to the 400-meter sprint that you can see here. So it says, using the SMART principles, try to come up with a target that applies each aspect of the SMART principle. So once you've come up with a target, I want you to write it down. And just once you've written it down, beneath that target that you've just written down for this 400-meter sprinter, I want you to try and apply that SMART principle. So how is it specific? How is it measurable? How is it accepted? How is it realistic? And how is it time-bound? Okay, so you may have come up with some sort of target similar to this. Okay, it says, I have agreed with my coach to try and complete the 400-meter race under 59 seconds. Okay, so that is the target that you have written down for this specific athlete. So how is it specific? Well, it relates obviously to the 400-meter event, as it says there within the actual target itself. It's obviously measurable, isn't it? Because obviously we can see there that we can measure it based on using the stop clock and using the time element there. It's agreed, isn't it? Because the target does say that it's been agreed with the coach. It's also realistic. If we look at the world record for the 400-meter women event, it's just, I think, just over 49 seconds. So ultimately, that's a fairly realistic target in trying to get under 60 seconds. And it's also time bound, isn't it? Because we're looking here at a time phase of the end of the race to know whether we have achieved that specific goal. Okay, and finally, for the teaching and learning strategies for the teachers, for this particular task topic, I would look at getting the students to create some animations. So for things like the performance goals and the outcome goals, can they create some symbols, some logos, which are going to help them understand the difference between performance goals and outcome goals? Try and get the students to be the performers themselves and put themselves in the shoes of the performers. Get them to create their own performance and outcome goals, maybe for the sports that they play outside of school perhaps, or even within school. And that gives them hopefully a bit greater ownership in regards to applying that SMART principle as well within their actual learning. And then finally, setting some scenarios. So similar to as I've done in this PowerPoint video, just make sure you give them lots of examples of other athletes and how they can apply that SMART principle, and also how they can apply the type of goals to the levels of ability of performer. Okay, best of luck with this topic, folks.